Welcome back.
Thank you.
Let me kick off by saying, on behalf of the committee as a whole, to congratulate you, Secretary of State, on your appointment. We look forward to working with you, as well as obviously scrutinising your role. Today we want to focus the hour we have with you and Peter on this very important issue of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, but we look forward to an early opportunity to have you before us to range more widely across other areas of your responsibilities. And I'm very pleased that you have fulfilled this commitment within your first week in office. Let me start by referring to a statement made by your predecessor in February, in which she said that the department is working with others across the sector to develop appropriate accountability mechanisms arising from the Safeguarding Summit. Can you tell us what accountability mechanisms the department has now developed to ensure that all parts of the sector meaningfully monitor and report back on progress? And do you have plans for something to mark the anniversary of last October's summit?
Very good. Okay, well, thank you. And if I could just very quickly, before I get on to the specifics, say how grateful I am to be able to appear on what is basically my first real day as a cabinet minister. So I did a climate summit at breakfast time, and then first cabinet meeting NSC, and now I'm with you. I also am very pleased that we're talking about this particular issue. It's an issue which I know the committee has taken very seriously, and I want to pay tribute to your excellent report on the issue. I also feel that we should pay tribute to my predecessor, Penny Mordaunt, who has put a huge amount of energy into this.
Absolutely.
And to reassure you that I take it very seriously, and I will be pushing it forward with absolute energy. As you're aware, the fundamental structure through which we are looking at this is to get, firstly, the prevention angle right. So trying to make sure that we have as few of these cases as we possibly can. Secondly, in the horrible situation in which a case like this appears, learning how to really listen and work out what on earth has gone wrong. And then thirdly, working out what we can do to protect victims or survivors. And then finally, what on earth we can do to learn lessons. You'll be aware of the various steps that we've taken. We're setting up now a new £20 million resource hub. We have a safeguarding unit, which is run by Peter, who I think can talk in more detail about some of the work of the unit. We are driving this through our conversations with a huge range of partners. So you'll be aware that we are driving, particularly your question around accountability, with the UN, with IFIs like the World Bank, with UK NGOs, with the other major donors, with research partners. And all of this responds to the stuff that's in the core of the report, which is how you get the sequence right. And in particular, the thing that interests me most in this, which is not the theory of it, but the gap between the rhetoric that you would apply here in the United Kingdom and the reality of what actually is happening on the ground in South Sudan if you get an allegation in a protection civilian camp on the edge of Malakal, and what's really involved in dealing with somebody else's legal system, somebody else's security challenges, as opposed to what we do here. But on the more specific, let me hand over to Peter.
Peter, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I think just a few things to mention. We chaired last year a summit steering group in preparation for the summit on the 18th of October. And since then, we have changed that into what we're calling a cross-sector steering group with representatives from all of the organisations who made the commitments in October. And together we're working to track progress on those commitments, to share lessons about what's going well, some of the challenges that we're facing. And in our last meeting, we discussed how we might report back as we head towards the 1 year on anniversary of the October summit. So we're trying to do something together to provide a sense of collective efforts and collective progress, or otherwise. But also, as the Secretary of State says, for each individual group who made commitments, there are their own accountability mechanisms. So, for example, for the United Nations, fairly recently, well, in February, the Secretary-General published his latest report on progress against their commitments. And we can push through, we can ask some quite searching questions about that through the standard UN procedures and committees that we're represented on. And then as donors, we will also be presenting a one-year-on report. And you may have heard, I wasn't here for the earlier session, but you may have heard from other groups about what their plans might be.
Not a lot, to be honest, but we'll come to that in a moment.
Okay, fine. So,
Thank you. Nigel.
Thank you. Secretary of State, as you know, everybody around this table is committed towards the international development sector. It's a £14 billion project and helping the most vulnerable people throughout the world, including the topic that is under conversation today. So you've got a lot of work on your plate, and yet 3.5 days into the job, you're telling Sophie Rich that you want to be Prime Minister. Now, how can we be absolutely convinced that you are committed totally to the job that you've just been put into, and that part of your mind, because we could be in a leadership election in a few weeks.
Nigel, I'm going to stop you there, because we expressly said we wanted to devote today to this important issue of sexual exploitation. And I'll allow the Secretary of State to reply to what's essentially
particularly on this
party political
subject,
questions.
So I completely understand where you're coming from. I have some advantages taking over this job. I'm probably the only Secretary of State who occupied every Commons junior ministerial role in this department before I took it over. I understand, therefore, our programmes in the Middle East, Asia and Africa in enormous detail, in a way that people wouldn't. And in addition to that, without being too defensive, I've spent much more of my working life in international development than I assume than anyone else who's taken over this job. So I have some advantages. It is true that the Prime Minister has signalled that she is stepping down, and therefore I and at least half a dozen other Cabinet colleagues have expressed an interest in succeeding her. But I'm sure they, like me, will remain entirely committed to doing our jobs as powerfully as possible. And I want to be judged on how well I do this job. It's a department I'm deeply proud of. I feel very well equipped to take it over, and I think I can make an enormous difference, particularly on issues like climate.
Yep. I wanted to give you the opportunity to at least respond to what people would be thinking. So,
thank you.
And you've done that today. So can I ask you specifically on the question that is under consideration today, which is we're looking at the commitment document, which David has now said to the private sector that they wouldn't be called to sign up to. What do you think is the utility of the commitment document if we're not really asking everybody to sign up to it?
Well, I think the logic with a loss of the strategy that we're pursuing here is getting the balance right between providing protection to the most vulnerable and being realistic about the types of control that an organisation like DFID can actually exercise. So, and this goes maybe to the heart of some of the ways in which we agree and in other ways only partially agree with your own report. So this, your point about the private sector is part of a general pattern of arguments which are being made in this report about asking us why we're not doing more. Why we're not doing more on whistleblowers, why we're not doing more with special investigators, why we're not putting stiffer requirements on individuals. I think the answer is that to understand the role that we're trying to play here, it is not to be an international policeman or pretend that the Department for International Development can micromanage and control what other people are doing. What we are trying to do is make it absolutely clear that in terms of anybody who works with us, what the standards are we're holding to, do our very best to influence other major donors and IFIs and UN to make sure that they meet our same standards. So when they're giving grants to people, the same applies, whether it's the private sector or it's the NGO sector. And then making sure through our resource hub we can provide the training and the information and the protection and the processes of learning how to do this for people who don't necessarily work with us. But I think there is a slight, and I suspect we'll come back to this through the course of this hour, we do have a slightly different sense, I guess, of how we view our role in relation to other people. So our emphasis is, from people who take money from us, an absolute direct requirement that we will hold them fully to account. For the rest of the people, it is about influencing, it's about shaping the way they do and bringing them along with us, because we actually believe the best way of achieving this is to bring these people willingly to accept these ideas and throw themselves behind it, rather than trying to compel them to sign up to documents.
But I think we're getting a sense from even the evidence we've taken today that there seems to be a lack of urgency about it, and my goodness me, haven't we in the past had some of the chief executives of some of these charities that have actually helped to burn the charities by the lack of urgency and almost disregard for what was going on under their watch, and we've all seen that. So I think the real sense for us is that if we've heard that many in the private sector aren't even looking at these commitments, that what faith can we have that there has now been an absolute sea change since this news broke, that so many vulnerable people were being abused?
Well, I think on the sense of urgency, my predecessor moved very, very rapidly, as soon as she came into office, to grip the situation. The changes that I've seen in this department during the short period I've been away, so I've been away from this department for about 15 months, have been very, very dramatic. Whether it's the creation of Peter's position and that entire unit, standing up that whole facility, whether it's the emphasis that's been put on the international statements, the £20 million that we're now putting into this resource hub, all this stuff has got off the ground very quickly. You've seen what's happened to Oxfam, you've seen what's happened to Save the Children. Yeah. I mean, actually, in quite a slow-moving sector, the impact made within 12 to 15 months, I think, has been pretty dramatic. And I can see Peter is keen to come in, so I'm going to defer to him.
Okay. So just briefly on that, I think I know the point that you're referring to from the statement. I think there are also other points in there saying how much people have moved as a result of DFID's work. I think for me, the summit and the commitments that came out of there were a point in time. They were an incredibly important point in time that have shifted the debate and shifted people's focus onto this. What we're trying to do now is to hardwire the changes and the commitments that were made into things that are going to last longer and have more of an impact. So, as you will have maybe you heard earlier, but I think it comes out in this statement that they provided to you, it's the Supply Partner Code of Conduct, actually, which probably has more teeth than a document that was presented to the summit last year. So what we're trying to do with...
So you've got no faith in this, the commitment document then yourself?
Absolutely, we have absolute faith in it, but I think the way that it will have longevity and it will last for many more years is actually to build the key points from that into other processes. We're doing this with the donors as well. You know, we've got a fantastic statement from the October summit, but we're now through the DAC, through the process of agreeing a recommendation with a capital R, which will mean that all donors' performance on safeguarding is assessed through the regular peer review process over the years to come. I think that will have a much greater effect than just a summit document.
Can I ask you then, Peter, are you on top of this completely? That you can give us a commitment that we're not going to have a repeat of the exercise that we saw just over a year ago, which hit the news headlines? And could you also give a commitment that if any examples of this abuse is still going on, that you will be completely transparent about it, not just withdraw the funding from the charity or the organisation, the private sector organisation, but that you will actually expose them for the deficiencies that have taken place?
Mr. Evans, if it's a question of making commitments, I feel that's something that I, rather than a civil servant, should be doing. The answer is yes, and to develop that, there has been a very, very dramatic change in the way in which the entire sector looks at these organisations. And what happened with Oxfam and Save the Children has set a fire under the entire sector. I mean, even very, very small NGOs now are falling over themselves to generate these policies on safeguarding. They are looking at all their staff in a completely different way. The number of cases coming forward is far larger than it was before. Yeah. Okay. Caveat, as you'd be aware, this is a huge sector, right? So people are spending many tens of billions of pounds around the world. They're operating in over 100 countries, and they're operating in very, very tough places. So the question of what exactly is going on day by day in Equatorial Province in South Sudan, or what's going on in Kasai in DRC, is tough. And the challenge has to be brought down to the level of an individual abuser and an individual victim or survivor, often in a remote rural area in a country at war. Right? And some of this relates to the way we need to think about domestic abuse in Britain. So in making this commitment, it is important to understand it. It's the same as what would happen if you put a Secretary of State up and said, can you promise there will be no more domestic abuse in Britain? Right? The answer, of course, is this. Right? The horror of this is that it's about whether people feel the confidence to come forward, whether they feel their legal system is going to protect them, whether their security is going to be protected, or actually the nature of these abusive bullying relationships, which may actually lead the individual to be shy to come forward. Right? The difficulties that you would have having somebody who was suffering domestic abuse in a home in Britain and making sure that they came out of that home and accessed the legal system and had confidence is multiplied 100 times if you put it into a village in Kasai in southern DRC. And so we've got to get the right combination of idealism and practicality here and not try to pretend to you that we have instant answers to this. What we're trying to do is work with some of the most experienced, dedicated aid organisations in the world to say you've really got to up your game. You've got to stay on top of your staff, you've got to train your staff, you've got to make sure that they're aware from the moment they begin working of the dangers, the fact that if you're giving a lot of money to someone and you're providing them with health and education, you're in a position of power. And if you're in a position of power, you're potentially in a position of abuse. And the people that you're potentially abusing are people who are going to find it very, very difficult to push back. They're going to find it difficult to access the media. They're going to find it difficult to access ombudsmen. They're going to find it difficult to access the donors. Right? Much more difficult than they would in a British context, but we know in a British context how difficult it is even at home.
Thank you for that answer. I think we've got the commitment that you're seeing this as a primary issue, not as a secondary issue. So
just on the original line of questioning, and probably this is more for Peter, what frustrated, I think, all of us in our earlier session was the sense that the commitments made by the private sector didn't have signatories or organisations that had to follow that up, whereas the commitments made by others did. Why was the private sector treated differently?
I think one of the challenges with the private sector is there is no kind of sector-wide body who can represent all of them. So, just as we have bonds for the NGOs, who all organisations, all of the NGOs felt comfortable for a bond to coordinate their preparations for a bond to present that and coordinate it, there isn't an equivalent. And each private sector organisation is a private entity in its own right. So there isn't the same kind of locus there. But I hopefully you've got a sense that there is all of those organisations who are working in the international field are taking this incredibly seriously. And I think they know that if they don't, then we won't fund them. And I mentioned the Supply Partner Code of Conduct. DFID has a team dedicated to ensuring compliance with that, and they are doing very regular checks on we added in new language in August on safeguarding into that, and the team is doing regular checks, and if any contracts are found to be wanting, then they're very unlikely to receive funding from us.
Pauline.
DBS checks are for people working with vulnerable or underage children, vulnerable adults as well as underage children. The aid sector, we heard today, doesn't have to have DBS checks. Would that not be something that DFID could insist on, that all the people in the NGOs or the private sector organisations could insist on DBS checks? Because that would be it's only relevant on the day it's issued, I accept that, but if somebody has got a history of abuse, they may have had some dealings with the law, so that might help the situation, but it's not something that I think DFID have suggested that they could do. So I'd like to know about that. The other thing is, we know that what we hear about is just the tip of an iceberg, or suspect it's only the tip of an iceberg. would it not be a good idea for DFID to commission a study of exactly how widespread this abuse is? Because if it's the tip of an iceberg, we need to know how much is under the water, not just the bit that we can see. And that, I think, would help if we had somebody looking at that. But my main question is, we've talked to the private sector suppliers today. They've only had one collective meeting since the conference last year. I don't think they felt it was urgent enough. And it only took place less than a week ago, I guess, because they knew they were coming here and they better do something. So do you think this is a high enough level of follow-up? And why hasn't DFID pushed for a faster and more rigorous collective response from them?
Okay, so I think take these things in reverse order. First thing is I'm shocked to hear that, so I will undertake to get these private sector supplier in and work out what on earth's going on. I agree with you. On the face of it, that seems very disappointing. Right? So we've got to hold their feet to the fire. Research, I agree. And I will get the research team to make sure that we really focus on understanding this. And we have quite a substantial research budget, and it's quite a good way of using some of that budget to look at this. The DBS issue we can reflect on. I think that is perhaps more challenging, simply because of the scale that you're talking about. In a big intervention in Afghanistan, for example, at the height, there were over 100,000 international civilian consultants on the ground and over 1 million Afghans working directly or indirectly in the NGO sector in Afghanistan. And trying to really work your way through these sorts of checks, which are pretty, I don't want to say onerous, but are significant things even within the context of the United Kingdom. If you want to work in a school, work with vulnerable adults, and imagine putting that into a developing country, I think is going to be tough, is my instinct, but I'm very happy to look at it and report back to you.
Thanks. In terms of the private sector suppliers, I mean, we've been shocked today at the lack of movement, really, that they have had since the conference. They kept talking about before the conference they've done this and that, but not since the conference. So the NGO sector appear to have, their working groups appear to have been doing a better job. I'm still not convinced that it's good enough. How do you think, I mean, you said you'll tackle it, and I'm really pleased to hear that, because this disparity can't be justified, really, can it?
Well, so I think I'll start, in essence, by saying to them what you've just said to me. So I need to get them in round a table and say, you've got to do better. And frankly, this seems disappointing to me. It's certainly disappointing to the International Development Committee, and I can't see any reason why these individuals who work with us and are deeply dependent on us for their contracts shouldn't be doing more, because it's a huge priority for us, and we want them to signal that they've really got that.
Yeah, well, the Charity Commission have some locus over serious incidents reports from the NGOs. There's nothing for DFID's private sector suppliers. How are you assuring yourself that ongoing basis that the private sector suppliers are responding to the allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse appropriately, including having disclosed these to DFID? Because they talked also about the privacy, people's privacy, and that they couldn't disclose things. Now, surely they have to be able to disclose it to you, because how can you monitor? Because they're saying that you should be doing the monitoring, not them.
Okay, yes, those are very good points. And I think I don't accept the argument that they cannot disclose. Insofar as charities can disclose, the private sector can also disclose. The same data rules apply to both. So there isn't an argument for some sort of exemption for the private sector. And this division between the private sector and NGOs in relation to international development is misleading. Right? And many of our implementing partners are private sector organisations, not NGOs. And therefore, it's really important if we are saying this is a DFID project funded by our taxpayers in somebody else's country with a flag on it. It doesn't really matter whether the person doing it is KPMG or whether the person doing it is Oxfam. Our responsibility to vulnerable people on the ground is the same, and our expectations from that organisation are the same.
I mean, you did mention about the fact that things have changed in the aid sector, and I think it is probably as a result of our report last year, because before there have been lots of incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse happen in the past, and people said, oh no, this is terrible, and then it's all died down and everything's gone back to normal. I think our report probably has stopped it going back to normal, which is good. But really, DFID have to take the lead on this. Really seriously take the lead worldwide.
Yeah, I think you've done an enormous amount. I also do think, again, to praise my predecessor, I think Penny Mordaunt was very serious about this.
Excellent.
And did an enormous amount.
We are halfway through our time and only about 30% of the way through our questions, so I'm going to encourage shorter questions and shorter answers. Virendra.
Thank you. Hi. How's DFID identifying which UN agencies are making tangible progress on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, and which are weaker? And how are you using donor power to bring the weaker agencies up to standard?
Yeah, great, thank you very much. So there are a number of ways in which we're doing this. We carry out central assurance assessments on all our major partners. This is a form of due diligence. And since last year, we have extended that to include safeguarding as one of the areas that we look at. So DFID is in the process of carrying out central assurance assessments to test all the UN agencies' capacity on safeguarding. So that's one way in which we're doing that. Also, there are annual executive board meetings for most of the major agencies. So we work with other donors. So, for example, last year we've had joint statements with up to 50 other donors to really put pressure on individual agencies to say, look, we know you're trying to do a lot on this, and to give them credit, many of them are. I think they are taking this very seriously, but I think you're right that progress is patchy. So we have also written in specific language into our funding agreements with them to say we will only give you money if you are performing well on this as well. So we're using a combination of things and also working with the UN system to put internal pressure and with other donors to put more external pressure on them.
In a response to a written question on UN AIDS from IDC chair in January, Minister Byrd told us that DFID would be assessing how well UN AIDS had implemented the recommendations of the independent expert panel on harassment, sexual harassment and abuse of power at UN AIDS as part of your regular review of funding. Have any assessments now been made?
So we're in the process of doing an assessment. It is not complete yet. A lot has happened since last December and since that statement was made. The UNAIDS has introduced a management action plan to respond to the findings of the independent experts panel that reported in December, and a series of actions were agreed on that. We have made sure that we are on a working group which is tracking progress of that. So at the moment there is no answer to that. We haven't completed anything. It is an ongoing process, and I hope, I don't lead on this myself, but my colleague who sits in Geneva who engages on this, I think that in a couple of months' time we will be in a better place to answer that question.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, we're joined today by Maria Miller under the guesting arrangements. Maria will ask the next line of questions. Thank you.
And Secretary of State, in your responses this morning, you've talked consistently about victims who are in remote locations in very difficult circumstances. But the reality is the victims who've spoken to me live in European cities, working for household charities, names that we all know, spending UK taxpayers' money, and you haven't addressed that. So with that in mind, we know from all of our experience across government that giving victims of sexual violence and abuse a voice is really important. Yet the focus of all your initiatives, or predominantly your initiatives, is about preventing perpetrators from getting involved in projects, not in helping victims report the appalling crimes they may have been subject to. Now, earlier you did address this in terms of people on the ground, how difficult it would be in South Sudan to report these things, but it's not as difficult if you're working in a European city. Why are you not focusing on this, or do those victims not matter as much as those that are on the ground?
Clearly, any victim or survivor has an equal right and matters equally. I just think that much, much more work has been done in the developed world and in Britain in practice around this issue from a whole range of different angles than has happened in most of the developing world. In other words, the knottiest, most difficult problems we face are of people who do not begin to have the legal structure, the security structure, the employment laws, the protections, or the media that exist here. So in terms of trying to get our head round a very, very tough issue, absolutely we have a commitment to people who work for charities in Britain, just as the British government has a commitment for anybody working for the civil service in Britain, or the British government has a commitment to anybody working for a business in Britain. We have a general moral obligation towards victims and survivors of abuse of any sort in this country. But in terms of specifying the specific issues that relate to this department that make it different from the general form of obligation that you would have for somebody, whether they were working for Shelter or Mencap or Alzheimer's UK or Oxfam in Britain on the one hand, and the type of issues that you have dealing with the kind of abuse that we've seen recorded in Haiti, or this kind of abuse we've seen recorded in Sudan, or the kind of abuse we've seen recorded in Somalia. I think those are different issues that need to be approached in different ways. And in the former case, we have a much more developed legal and political framework than exists in these other countries.
So how much new money are you actually spending on these initiatives that you're putting in place to deal with these problems, not only domestically, but also on the ground in these difficult places?
So we're putting approximately £20 million into the initial response and an additional £20 million into research to respond to Mrs. Latham's challenge. So approximately £40 million going into this.
And that's new money?
That's new money.
And how much have you done to actually work with those organisations who are outside of the mainstream, or indeed not even contractors to the UK government at the moment?
So for that, we are setting up a resource hub which is exactly designed for this. I mean, one of the challenges is that whereas a large NGO with a turnover of hundreds of millions of pounds a year and thousands of employees, so Save the Children or Oxfam or CARE or Mercy Corps, has very, very developed policies in place, has an enormous number of staff to develop these issues, can put a lot of energy into writing project proposals, has the funds in order to provide the safeguarding policies and the lines in their administration. If you're dealing with charities that we want to be working much more closely with, in other words, the sorts of NGOs that you'll have in your own constituency, which might have a turnover of £200,000, £300,000 a year, might have 4 or 5 staff, they really are very likely to be lacking the resources, the expertise, the policy documents, the procedures on safeguarding, and indeed a range of other issues, but particularly on safeguarding. That's why we're creating a resource hub which is designed for these people to be able to reach into us. And one of the things we can provide, and the Charity Commission can provide, and indeed some of the other international NGOs have been very good at offering to provide themselves, is that first off-the-record private advice to talk through some very, very tricky issues of how you work your way through these situations. Because, as I say, in a UK domestic context, the route is pretty straightforward. The route is almost certainly will be a legal route almost immediately. In an international context, if you are in 30, 40 of the countries in the developing world, the reality is that if the victim or the survivor attempts to take a case to a local court, they could get themselves killed. And there's absolutely no confidence at all that the court would find in their favour. Therefore, the victims are very, very reluctant to come forward. And this adds another problem, which is that because no legal process has taken place, there is no fully complete evidence around the perpetrator. So you're then faced, and this is the issue the small NGO has to deal with, that perpetrator then moves on to another job. You have a strong suspicion based on an allegation that they've committed an abuse. You haven't been able to bring a legal case forward because the victim or the survivor wishes to retain their anonymity and is too scared of this individual to bring it forward. You then have to work out, do you list them? What kind of reference do you give them? How do you let them continue in a way that also respects their rights? Because they might protest that they're innocent.
Thanks, Neil. Richard.
Thanks. I mean, you've spoken very eloquently about the situation of a victim or survivor in South Sudan or in DRC. Could you say a little bit more about how the resource hub, as is planned, is in practice going to be able to reach them?
Yeah.
Because, you know, in a sense, your point about the fact that they wish to retain anonymity, the fact that they probably haven't got a easy or any kind of legal system to be able to go to will still be there. What, in practical terms, will the resource hub do?
So in Richard, in practical terms, and this is the heart of the problem, a huge amount depends on the policy and the practice of that NGO on the ground in DRC. So realistically, what would happen is if you were the victim or survivor of abuse, you would have to find some way of contacting the management of that NGO or that UN agency and say, Richard, I suffered abuse from this individual. And then you would have to put a lot of confidence in the fact that you as the senior manager are going to take that allegation seriously, that you have the right policies in place, that that individual is going to protect your anonymity and your security, that they're going to take action against the perpetrator. All of that can only come about really through a total change in culture of these NGOs. So I think one of the things that is changing quite quickly is that I suspect 2 years ago you'd go to the senior manager and it would be much more likely to be swept under the carpet. Today, I think, if you go to an implementing partner of Oxfam or SAVE or UNDP or UNHCR, I think it is much more likely now that people are alert to this, will act, and will be very conscious that if they're a British NGO, they have an obligation to report this to the Charity Commission, they have an obligation to report to their senior management, they have an obligation to report to their board, all of which should be included in the safeguarding policy document. But in the end, it's that kind of thing. I mean, it stands or falls on the culture and the policy of that NGO on the ground.
The kind of problems that adult victims and survivors face would be magnified several times when it comes to children, but they themselves will often be those most vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. I mean, how do you feel that issue can be addressed? And will the department be providing any resource specifically to target that area?
Well, I think that's it's a very, very, very good challenge. And I think as we do this research project, and a £20 million research project is a pretty significant research project, we can make sure that we focus hard on that issue of the protection of children. I mean, without overdoing this, that is a huge issue worldwide, setting aside the actions, the NGOs, protection of children in Afghanistan, for example, unfortunately from rape and sex abuse is an issue that goes a long way beyond the NGO community, and where people working on children's rights are struggling with these issues. But you're right, yeah, let's make that central to our research project.
Paul.
Thank you very much. Can I welcome you to your position and offer you my congratulations as well. The hub that we've been talking about, the Resource and Support Hub, how can you, what are you doing to ensure that the hub doesn't duplicate work that's a resource that's already there from other organisations, IASC and CHS Alliance and those sort of organisations?
Okay. So we did an initial mapping and study last year to see what was out there, to see, first of all, is there a gap in the market, is there really a need for this, and that was quite thorough, and we've published that, and the overwhelming consensus from everybody we spoke to and the evidence was that there is a need for this. So that's not to say that there isn't anything out there, absolutely. So you've mentioned a few things there. So what we're trying to do with the Resource and Support Hub is it will probably be a consortium of a number of organisations. We're going to go out to tender fairly soon, so the exact value of the contract is to be determined. But we're looking for a kind of a one-stop shop where any organisation, whether they're working primarily, if there is for to benefit aid workers in organisations or individuals or smaller organisations in remote areas, that they can have access. They have some confidence by going to that hub that all of the key information is there, and the resources that they can draw on in terms of training, learning, etc. are there. The other things that we want to do with that is to make sure that they have access to quality assured services. So it might be that they don't have any investigative capacity in their own organisation to deal with the type of scenario that's been mentioned. So how can we make sure that they are aware and have what the access routes might be to that sort of thing? And the other thing that we want to do with the Resource and Support Hub is to try and develop kind of innovation and more data about really kind of what works in this field. So we obviously need to join up with what's happening in the existing research and the planned research that's going on as well. But I think it will build on what is there, but not duplicate. I think it will complement it.
So how do you make sure that those the resources there have impact rather than just a repository?
Yeah, so I think this is the point about what we want to do with the consortium is to make sure we've got the kind of the world-leading experts in this area who can really say, yes, this is something which is going to add value, or actually this is something which we think is perhaps a bit weaker. And then so this idea of quality assurance, and so that if small organisations say we want some more help on this, we can be sure that the advice that they're being given and the tools that they're being pointed towards are the very best.
So who actually oversees the resources on it?
So it's not been created yet. So
Sure.
we're going to go out to tender soon, and we expect it to be up and running by the autumn once the tender process has happened. But it will be obviously overseen from within DFID. If it's a contract, both through our procurement and commercial department and the safeguarding unit, the overall responsibility, accountability will sit with my team on this.
So they would look at it on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have a huge amount of contact on an ongoing basis with lots of different groups, and we have done since the summit and before. I should say even with the private sector as well, even though they had their first one, say, 6-monthly gathering last week, and actually that is coincidence because they said back in October that they were going to do that.
Factory, isn't it? Even if it's
no, indeed, but we've had a lot of contact with them in between times. I just wouldn't want you to go away with the impression that they've not done anything over the last 6 months, because I say through our supply partner code of conduct, very regular contact from our procurement teams as well. Absolutely, we need to get them in and get them really focused on it. But I think we equally, with going back to the issue of child safeguarding, we work very closely with our child hub in our education department, and with experts such as Keeping Children Safe to work out how best we can really help and focus on this area. And we reach out a lot to representatives of victims and survivors, whether they are children, whether they are women, whether they are people with disabilities, to understand better how we can engage them and how we can support them as we go forward.
So you mentioned in the response to our report about the having access to specialist investigators within the hub. Is that still
so? This is one of the things we've got to say, and I can't preempt it and say we've got to go out to market.
It's still something you've got in your tender document.
It is still a possibility, whether they are housed in the hub or whether the hub goes out and works out where those people sit. And actually, whether it's a question of signposting rather than people sitting in the hub. No, so for example, OCHA have issued, they've said there's a $1 million fund to help organisations with investigations. Again, we don't want to duplicate, but it may be a case of making people aware of what is there and saying, actually, you might want to go and talk to OCHA and use that funding that's there, and that will pay for specialist investigators who might sit in the hub or they might sit somewhere else. We haven't.
But the tender has the capacity to have that within it if it's not decided to duplicate. If it's not decided that you're duplicating.
We'll wait and see what the bids are and what people say, but it's certainly an option. Yeah.
So how much emphasis are you going to be placing finally on supporting organisations to conduct robust victim-centred investigations as recommended in the report?
As recommended in
our report originally.
Well, I think we'll try and strike the balance between the different needs on whether it's investigations, whether it's capacity building. It'll probably be a range of needs. And I think what we don't want to do is kind of box ourselves in and just say the resource and support hub will just do this or primarily that. I think we want it to be a flexible resource because every person or every organisation's needs will be slightly different.
Thanks, Paul. We've got 12 more minutes with you and 4 more questions. So, Lloyd.
In our report, we identified that improving complaints mechanisms was one of the key things in bringing and to bring down barriers in reporting to get to the root of the problem. How are you enabling NGOs and the private sectors to build high-quality, content-specific complaints mechanisms? I guess you've already touched on some of that with the hub. And how are you making sure that that money doesn't end up eating away from money that is meant to go to frontline aid? So are you putting more money in? Are you making sure it's ring-fenced and it's not eating away of other... What protections are you doing there?
Well, let me take the second and then I'll come back to the complaints mechanism. So the money that we're putting into this will come out of our overall ODA spend. So it will come at the expense of frontline aid. However, the sums of money that we're talking about compared to a £14 billion ODA budget are about 40 million. So it's a relatively small essential thing. But yes, every time we take on an additional responsibility of this sort, we end up diverting money away from the front line. And it's also worth bearing in mind that every time we take on a responsibility of this sort, we implicitly and understandably and necessarily in this case add a burden on the people that are working with us, a compliance burden on them. So that's only relevant because we have to be very thoughtful about how we ensure that we continue to have small, active NGOs and volunteers in this sector and not create a system where the only people who can ever get a DFID contract in the future are people with thousands of employees, huge policy documents, massive compliance mechanisms. But we have to find the right balance on that.
Yeah, so I think we don't want a kind of a plethora of complaints mechanisms. We're not necessarily saying that every organisation has to have a fully developed complaints mechanism. Parts that we are looking for develop whistleblowing policies in every organisation. So that's part of our due diligence assessment of organisations. DFID has strengthened its own complaints and reporting line, so it's much easier for anybody who may feel within their own organisation they don't have a route, or maybe they don't want to report within their own organisation. They can come to us if they want to. So we've done that as well. I think also it's not just upon us to do all of it. We're also trying to work through. We've got to think about how what the architecture is in a different place. So where you've got a humanitarian emergency, the UN will be coordinating that. You will have a humanitarian coordinator. So thinking about how they build community-based complaints mechanisms. So, for example, a member of our team went out to South Sudan in December, was working with the UN and DFID and other partners on that, thinking about how we could extend those mechanisms to make it easier for people.
Just on both those points, so are you offering kind of off-the-shelf for those small NGOs that Rory mentioned? So if they come to you and say, we don't really have much developed here, but can you just provide us with a process that we need to go through that will be stage 1, 2, 3? And then secondly, are we involving the survivors and victims in country in that process?
Okay, so two things. On the first, yes, we would have the resources so that people can see some examples of what we believe to be good quality policy documents and examples that they can draw down. Secondly, we have allowed now, for the first time, that you can, in your bid to DFID for money, put in a line item in regard to safeguarding. So if you're a very small NGO who doesn't have that kind of capacity, we would welcome your saying, okay, we have real expertise, we can do an amazing job in this particular place, but we're going to need an additional safeguarding officer as part of this, and we'd be happy to accept that in terms of their budget and their bid on a case-by-case basis, because there will be other organisations, very large organisations that we would expect to have that anyway. On the question of including victims and survivors, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's something that this research project is very well suited to look at.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, we did a listening exercise last year, as you know, with representatives of victims and survivors, which we published in October, and we've been building on that work to understand better how we can help them access and how we can better build complaints mechanisms.
On the this independent inquiry that you seem to have accepted, is there any thought about bringing in other organisations that might have gone through other similar kind of journeys? FIFA, for example, others who might have some expertise, who are not just from the aid sector and are able to put an external, slightly more independent look at this. I mean, I mentioned FIFA only because of some of the work that they've done on that, but there are others out there.
Well, I mean, I think this is a really good point. I mean, we need to learn from all these people. I mean, we're not the only sector to go through this. I think we're a sector where, because of the place in which we operate, the problems can be more extreme and more difficult to identify, more difficult to protect individuals. But this is a problem at the root of our culture and our institutions that goes a long way beyond aid, because it's in the nature of power, of patriarchy, of hierarchies. I mean, these things we can learn, but we can also learn, I mean, without overdoing this, we can also learn an enormous amount without going to FIFA from the UK civil service. I mean, our own Home Civil Service has gone through a huge journey over the last few years on these issues. I mean, if you compare my last job, the Ministry of Justice, today, and the kinds of efforts that our Permanent Secretary is making, particularly around issues of bullying and harassment in the workplace, compared to where we were 5 years ago, it's very, very different. It's very different in terms of the importance attached to it by managers, the centrality of this in training packages, the amount of communication around this issue, the sense of staff awareness and confidence.
So you said you can.
You have to move us because I'm really keen we don't lose the whistleblowing question.
You said you can. Is it just you will?
So I think we are.
Okay, that's all I just wanted to...
I think we are. So we were on a panel with FIFA in March. We were very engaged with DCMS on the domestic side and with others. So we are looking to learn from outside of the aid sector.
Just a really quick one from me and then on to Pauline. International Aid Ombudsman, where's that?
So we continue to look at it. We have some scepticism about it, which I think we've expressed in our response to the report. We will look at it carefully. The scepticism is, I think, to do with the general sense of creating more international ombudsmen with big sticks and very minimal power. I think that the danger is that it will become a onerous and perhaps potentially slightly toothless type of ombudsman. So that's what we have to really work out what it is. I mean, we've been through this with the, my constituency to take a much more less important issue. The dairy milk ombudsman, the supermarket ombudsman, turned out not to deliver everything that we wanted. We don't want to have a repeat of that. And the danger at an international level is that it becomes even vaguer than you can achieve at a domestic level.
Pauline.
Thank you. Can we move on to whistleblowers? DFID decided not to conduct a systematic audit of whistleblowing practices amongst the sector, although they planned to, because the NGO working groups said they deemed it unnecessary. Why? Why did DFID not? Yeah, it's historical, so I don't think Rory can do it.
Okay, I mean, I think the thing on whistleblowers is to say we have built it into our due diligence assessments. So that the enhanced due diligence process on safeguarding that was introduced last year includes a very specific section on whistleblowing. So every time we do a due diligence process on an implementing partner, we look at their whistleblowing processes. Every time we monitor a program, we will be looking at that as part of the broader monitoring as well. Whenever we do a central assurance assessment, we look at that. I should say we've done so far about 16 very detailed central assurance assessments of NGOs and how they are stacking up against the new enhanced safeguarding due diligence standards. And we've seen some really interesting progress on this. One or two have said, actually, we recognise we weren't as strong on this as we should have been. And one organisation, I'm not going to name them, has...
Is the this in that sentence safeguarding or whistleblowing?
Okay, good. Whistleblowing, sorry, apologies.
Sorry
not to be clear.
Yeah. Reassuring.
So on whistleblowing, so they have introduced a specific whistleblowing policy for their organisation, and they have written it into their downstream funding arrangements. So anybody who works for them as well, who they subcontract, has to have a very clear whistleblowing policy. So we felt that was the response that we had from others in the sector as well. That was the best way of addressing it in a very kind of practical, applied way, and people are learning as they're going and improving as we go along.
And standardly now, doing our due diligence, we will ask, do you have mandatory training in place on how to deal with whistleblowers? We're giving money to an organisation. Do you have the protection mechanisms in place for a whistleblower? And we typically would be asking these organisations to demonstrate that policy as part of the due diligence in getting any kind of contract from us.
So will there be protection then for whistleblowers? Because many whistleblowers that we've spoken to actually don't have jobs now because nobody will employ them because they've been a whistleblower. And we saw last October at the Safeguarding Summit, a whistleblower came up on stage and she obviously felt excluded from DFID's processes because the survivors, if you like, or the whistleblowers hadn't been included in the conference. How has DFID addressed this since the summit, and what would you do differently now that would involve whistleblowers?
Well, so we've set up a new independent reference group, and part of that is designed to learn the lessons from what happened on the 18th of October and make sure that whistleblowers are more included in that. I think there's an enormous amount more that we can and must do to protect whistleblowers, while also bearing in mind that this is, again, because I'm afraid I'm repeating myself, isn't only a problem for DFID. I mean, whistleblowing in general and protecting whistleblowers is really tough, and it gets many, many times more tough when you're a long way from the United Kingdom.
And how are you assuring yourself that the effectiveness of the whistleblowing policies are at the UN now?
So I think at the UN it's quite interesting. The Joint Inspection Unit of the UN has done a very thorough, quite recent reports about whistleblowing there, and found that there have been improvements, but still a long way to go. So I think for us that is one of the ways in which we will track that, see what's come out of that, and follow that through, through our central assurance assessments that we do of individual organisations, and also from the very practical examples that we receive. I'm not going to name organisations, but our safeguarding investigations team has had some quite detailed discussions recently with one UN organisation where we found that actually the protection of whistleblowers wasn't as good as we would have liked it to be. So we are following up on very concrete things, as well as doing the kind of systematic headquarters type assessment.
Rory, I think that the final thing, if I may, Mr. Chair, which is I think really interesting about this and where we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the committee, is that you've driven us to do an enormous amount on this, and I am picking up that you feel we can do an enormous amount more.
Yes.
But as a new incoming Secretary of State, I also feel this is a very, very interesting model for challenging us for other issues too, right? Other types of cross-cutting theme. So it could be child protection, but sitting listening to you, I wonder whether we couldn't actually also think about issues such as environmental sustainability in the same way. Providing resource hubs, working with our partners to do this. Human rights could be another example, in general, not just in relation to abuse and harassment. So insofar as we wish to raise standards across the aid sector in terms of protecting victims and survivors, but also other forms of protection. Protection of the environment from degradation, protection of the planet from carbon emissions, protection of waters from pollution, protection. I mean, there's many, many other protection issues where this type of cross-cutting approach, this attempt to say...
Well, I think as a committee we'd very much welcome that, but I should say Pauline has really been leading on this area for 3 years now.
I think this is too important to merge into and say, well, we're going to do lots of protection, so therefore sexual exploitation and abuse is just one of them. It's a really, really important in this sector, more than maybe in many other sectors, because it is happening, and it's happening here and now. We must not, under any circumstances, lose sight of that by saying, well, we're going to protect all sorts of things, because yes, they are important, but this is absolutely vital. Now,
Pauline, we're overrunning,
yes,
and that could be a very good note to end the session on, couldn't it?
Yeah,
Thank you very much indeed. And I promised you we'd deliver it in an hour. We've overrun slightly. So